All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. And today we're talking about performances. This was a topic that was suggested last week by all and sundry. So when we're talking about performances, there are lots of different types of performances. And so let's say that you're writing a fantasy novel and your folks are going on a quest like they do. You might be very concerned with the quest, and there might be very few actual sidebar things. But, so all of the things that we talk about on the show are kinds of things that you might be interested in considering for a world that you're creating. And so, in fact, performances, everything from, the bard is performing in the tavern to we're going out to hear the orchestra. It could be potentially things that could enhance your world, potentially enhance your plot. In fact, my novel, which is still out on submission in a really ridiculous way, is actually features a big, huge musical performance as part of it, and it's like a really important part of the plot. And so humor me while I talk about that for a little minute, because I wanted it to be about orchestra. And I think when I chose orchestra, it was because I wanted to have it be large scale and public performances for lots of people, and also something that would be much easier for rich people to attend than for rich people to be interested in. But I also was actually thinking back to the composing of the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. Because when that was first performed, it actually caused a scandal, and people started walking out of the performance before it was finished. And so, in fact, there's a piece of music in the book, which is called The Catacomb. That's the name of the piece of music. And it's mind-blowing, and everybody is totally scandalized by it. And I based it on the historical event of, the advent of the Rite of Spring. And because there's something about a big public performance that people share that experience, and they have a big emotional reaction to it, and it can set off really interesting kinds of plot events. And yes, the question of patronage is also there, because my main character is he's sort of inherited the running of this concert series, and he's very, very excited about the music, and everybody else is kind of like, it's a musical performance, whatever, so yeah, he's very into the music, and his friends are much less into the music. But I think also the other reason why I wanted to have a musical performance be part of it is that it's a story about nobility. And one of the things that has always been a little bit of a something that stirs things up socially and maybe changes who you would hang out with is art and artists and performance. And so, in fact, when I included it, I wanted to add that aspect of, well, normally, as nobles, we're not supposed to hang out with people of this sort, but in the name of art, we will do it. And that has other attendant kinds of consequences for the plot and the story and the society. Art is a sort of a boundary crossing thing. But there are lots of different types of performances. So let's go further from that. Oh, and one more thing before I leave the topic of that orchestra. I had to reinvent all the orchestral instruments because it doesn't occur. It's not a fantasy, and it's not a fantasy, and it's not a future scenario. It's actually a secondary world. So I was like, oh, okay. So what are they playing in this orchestra? So I had to think through what kinds of things they would be playing, and they're in fact very similar to the things that are played in our orchestra, but slightly different. So I wanted to make sure they were different enough that I wasn't just slapping another name on a piano, you know, or slapping another name on a violin, but actually had thought through sort of what the instruments looked like and why they were a little different and that sort of thing. Anyway, so that was kind of a fun world building exercise. I see lots and lots and lots of suggestions cropping up in the sidebar. So let's turn there for a second. Wow. Okay,
yes,
we're going to be on this for a while.
That's like fun.
Okay, let's start with court jesters for a minute. Sometimes they give performances, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry?
I mean, I'm wondering about court jesters in terms of like whether they gave performances or whether they were just supposed to be around and doing their thing.
I don't know enough about them. So I don't know if they had command performances, as in you're hanging around, perform now. If that was, they're hanging around so that they will be available at any moment, or if they were just there.
I mean, I suppose if you have one in a fictional world, you could do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, but what is the purpose of a court jester? So, and that might give us an entertainment.
Well, I mean, if you look back at the jesters in Shakespeare, a lot of them were sort of cracking jokes, but also sort of satirizing things that were going on in, you know,
dropping truth bombs.
Yeah, dropping truth
royalty.
Bombs.
Yeah,
let's use
itinerant
putting it.
So, as opposed to the court jesters.
Speaking truth to power, I think, was one of their sort of functions. But okay, so puppetry. I'm glad that you mentioned that, in fact, Jay.
Yep.
Puppetry performances. Wow. So if you're looking at things like Guignol in France and, you know, Punch and Judy sort of stuff, there is a lot of cultural information packed into a performance of that nature. I mean, it's ostensibly humorous, but what people consider to be humorous in a puppetry show is, at least in those old-fashioned ones, is very revealing of our history and biases, I guess.
I think like also sort of not all, but a lot of like puppet shows take place on the street. So it's a very public performance. Everyone comes and looks. Hypothetically, if you like it, you leave some money. And so it's something where I think because it's kind of like cheap enough, like you can make the puppets, you can make the little stage. That is something like if you don't have a lot of means, it's something you can do that's a step up from begging for money.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think it's actually a really interesting contrast with the orchestra example, right?
Yep.
Because the people who attend are very different. The reasons they attend are very different. Well, you know, the puppetry show, you might just be walking by. Now, at this point, well, there are street performers, right? But at this point, like if you want to go to a Guignol performance in France, you usually have to buy a ticket. But these are interesting questions. So, you know, if there's a performance in a book that you're writing, who attends? Right? What class are they? And I think also one of the things that was mentioned when we were talking about this topic last week was what are the expectations for audience participation?
A puppet show might have like such a familiar story that everybody shouts out parts of it. You know, children and adults. Whereas, like, maybe, you know, if you're in an orchestra, you don't stand up and clap along in the middle of it.
Right. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
As opposed to a rock concert. Or...
Well, exactly. And I was just thinking of rock concerts because I always, you know, personally, I much prefer a studio-produced recording of a song to a live recording of the song. And one of the reasons is I want to hear the band sing. Right? I don't want to hear the audience sing.
Screaming.
But those
usually,
live performances of rock songs very, very often involve the audience singing along with part of the song.
Yeah. It's like, it's one of those things where it's funner if you're in the audience at the performance and it's not so much fun to listen to, you know, if you're just trying to listen to the song.
If you're part of it.
Yeah. But as performances, like you go to a rock concert with certain expectations. Also, it's going to be loud. You're going to be able to scream a lot. You know, the lighters now replaced by cell phones.
Yeah.
You know, and there's like, you know, maybe not necessarily fireworks, but there's going to be like some costume changes and there's going to be like high energy. You know, it's not just going to be like somebody sitting on a stage all by themselves in a spotlight with a guitar, unless that's exactly what you signed up for.
Right. Why don't you tell us about your thoughts on orchestras for a second, Shauna?
Oh, the orchestra was much less professional as we would, in our terms, in the 1700s. The musicians were not as good.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, probably a lot of high schoolers can play as well as musicians in the orchestras at the time. The orchestras were smaller, and the musicians had more leeway in their behavior. I've read that many musicians did not show up at rehearsals, but hired someone to go, so that at the performance of the music for the first time, the musicians were playing the music. They had never seen it before.
Oh, wow.
Oh my God.
The era of the virtuoso and started in the 1800s.
Well, I remember actually, I've seen at least a couple of movies. The one about Mozart comes to mind, where the composer was actually writing the piece of music right up to the last minute. Right?
And I think the audience was more rowdy, although it still was a more upper class audience like today.
Yeah.
And the instruments were not evolved to the modern forms yet in some cases. And what else was I going to say that was very interesting about? Anyway, the playing was sloppy. Oh yes, the most important difference, which I didn't write down, the most important difference was that the audience was hearing each piece for the first time. Composers would compose for an event, the musicians would play it, and then the next performance, they'd play something else that was composed for the event. So that unlike today, where you have classical radio stations that play music, some classical radio stations only play like greatest hits classical. Yeah. And some orchestras only play greatest hits classical music to try to attract people. There was no expectation in the 1700s that the audience would know the music. In fact, they almost never did, because music was rarely repeated. Which is why Handel's music sounds so much alike if you play it all in a row. He used many of the same themes or accompaniment styles over and over again, because he had to churn it out so fast and so voluminously.
Right, because you had to just keep putting it out, because it would just, it was flowing by like a river, and you couldn't capture it again. That's really interesting. Well, I mean, that reminds me of like improv, you know,
or jazz, where you sort of make it up as you go along, and it's like they're one-time sort of things unless somebody is recording it.
The fact that people couldn't record the performances for a long time, I think, has a huge influence on that.
Yes, it does. People didn't mind that the players were hitting wrong notes and dropping out and coming back in, because they had no standard to compare it with.
Yeah.
I suppose sort of like one of the first big changes to hit music would have been the publication of sheet music that people could, large numbers of people could get their hands on and play, you know, X thing, and that like it became reproducible and sort of standardized in that way, where it's like, oh, we have this thing and we just follow along with it.
Right.
And you can buy, you know, you can buy whatever sheet music you wanted by whoever you liked, or whatever was popular.
Yeah.
Also, the balance of input from the composer and the performers was very different. Nowadays, the composer specifies almost everything, where the staccatos go, where the increase and decrease in tempos and volume go. And the farther back in time you go, the less was specified and the more input the musician was supposed to provide in terms of knowing the current style, having good taste, whether they were even whether they were able to add the ornaments, or whether they left them out for safety's sake.
It reminds me of pop singers singing Christmas songs. Or you can barely recognize the melody because they're doing all their little doodly 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 doos. Right. But yeah, that would be very, very interesting. I actually, there's a similar phenomenon that I was actually just noticing when my kids have been performing Shakespeare plays. And the parallel is that this year in his drama club, my son is doing a more modern play, and the amount of annotation of what people are supposed to do and how is far greater than in Shakespeare's time. It's just, you know, in Shakespeare, your stage directions are like, exeunt, and that's it. Whereas in the modern plays, it's like, he takes a step towards her threateningly. Like, okay, right? Like, I mean, all of these things.
Really, wow.
Right? I mean, all of these things, though, are now able to be specified in the text of the play and also distributed to all the people who might like to perform it. And so it creates more regularized performances, and less is resting on the individual actors' choices, per se.
I have heard that orchestras, before recordings and at the beginning of recordings, each orchestra had its own style that was recognizable. But after recordings came into style, the orchestras listened to each other, and there was a convergence in how each piece was played.
Wow.
So that orchestras became less distinguishable from each other.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so there could be like one particular famous orchestra that people travel to see because their local orchestra just isn't as good as that they've heard this other orchestra is just amazing. So that's interesting that a whole orchestra could become, I don't know, notable.
Or, you know, maybe you've got this rebel group in the violin section that really likes pizzicato. Or, you know, like,
yeah, the conductor's trying to shut that down.
Very different, especially when less was being specified in writing in the music. So, thank you, Shauna. Wow, you are a fount of fascinating information.
Yes.
Okay, so we've gone a little bit into plays.
Audience participation.
Audience participation.
And styles of, because it's not always friendly.
Right. And in fact, well, it's whether audiences are participating or just reacting. Right?
Oh, yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Because an audience reaction, like, wow, this is a terrible play, I'm going to throw fruit at the players. Or, hey, I bought this basket of rotten fruit just because I'm in the mood to throw some fruit, right? Doesn't necessarily amount to what I would call audience participation.
I don't know, because I think there probably were people who, like, this was their fun.
Yeah.
And they set up. I mean, it's maybe not necessarily the participation you want, but there is certainly a sort of premeditation involved where they're like prepared to hate on you for entertainment's sake.
You, wouldn't you?
Yeah. It's right? Like, you bring that from home in the hopes of throwing it.
Right? We went to Colonial Williamsburg, which, if you ever get the chance to go there, is really, really wonderful. And one of the things that they have there is they have various different types of performances. And one of them is pantomime, which are basically like dramatic performances where you do have audience participation, where you're expected to yell certain things at, you know, at certain characters. Or
in a Rocky
one at one point where you could actually say, do it again, and then they would do the last 30 seconds of what they had just done in a totally different way.
Oh, wow.
Which was actually really amazing to watch. And of course, you know, you would do it right after the actors had just done something really dramatic and difficult to repeat. Like, do it again, and then they'd have to go back and find a new way of doing this. In the Colonial Williamsburg context, though, you've got this really interesting thing going on because it's kind of like a giant LARP, right? Live action role play, at the same time that it's features performances. So you can have people coming up to you to play violin while you're eating dinner, right? But at 4:30, if you're out in the street, you can join the crowd that is marching on the governor's mansion to demand independence. Right? So they're not only having these localized performances that are appropriate to the aspects of life that they're depicting in these different parts of the town, but they are also having very large-scale reenactments of historical events leading up to the Declaration of Independence. And so, yeah, I mean, you can go and you can participate in army training, for example. You know, or you can try to help the American spies, you know, get one step ahead of the British, and you know, and that so that's a very different type of audience participation, right? What Shauna was asking about Colonial Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg is like it's a whole town, and it includes the main street with all of the restored businesses along it. And so, in fact, in every business, you have people running the business. You can go in and talk to the wig maker. You can't buy a wig from them, but they have wigs, and they actually do engage in wig making there. You can go and you can see how they make windows. There's a specific name for it. What's it?
Glazing.
What?
Glazing.
Glazing, not glazing. It's not the glass part, but it's the framing of the windows.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Anyway, I've just lost the word. It doesn't matter. But they have a shop like that, and then they also have cafes. They have little clothing stores, and they actually sell clothing in the clothing stores, so you can buy historical clothing if you would like to. But it is like walking through an actual town of the period, and they even have the stocks right right next to the courthouse, and you can go in to the courthouse, and at certain times of day in the courthouse they will reenact trials, which is super cool. So in a way, that is not just a restoration of a historical town, but also a massive performance with little tiny performances inside it. It's sort of an Inception performance. Yeah, very cool if you ever get a chance to visit. So, hi, Cliff.
Hello.
So, oh my goodness, mimes.
I don't know why, like, everybody, like, America seems to be, like, pretty much united on everybody hates mimes.
Well,
I like mimes.
There are a bunch of different things going on there. One is a sort of every mime that I know about these days is actually a parody of Marcel Marceau.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, yeah. So like, I think that Marcel Marceau is, if you've ever seen him perform or ever seen a video of him performing, he's amazing. And the things that he did were unprecedented at that time. And he could look like he was walking into the wind when he wasn't. And he was really being a storyteller, right? A silent storyteller. And he was amazing at it. But I don't know, I think there's a degree to which people in the US like to make fun of the French.
Yeah. That's also kind of a given.
And there was a sort of I think he became so popular at a certain point that everybody tried to sort of pretend to be him, and then did it badly or just couldn't achieve the mastery that he had. And so it ended up being something that then became ridiculed, which is too bad, because in fact, his performances and mime, when it's done well, are amazing. And in fact, not too long ago, my family went up to see a performance by the Mummenschanz. Do you guys know those?
I've seen them.
Never heard of it.
Okay, I'm going to write it in the chat bar.
Okay.
I think there's a C in it.
They do the sort of silent sketches with they get into weird costumes, and the costume can be like a tube, and then they animate it to make it feel like it's alive for the audience. And they do that with puppets, but not the kind you put your hand in, but more like
the type you
they're wearing black and they manipulate things.
Yeah,
and,
like there's that Japanese puppet theater.
That's what's that, Bunraku?
Bunraku?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to go back to that idea in a second.
But they are much more avant-garde.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The shapes that they manipulate are not like Bunraku puppets. They're like they're abstract.
They're like, imagine a person who's entirely encased in a gigantic flexible cylinder.
Right.
Okay, yeah,
So
I've seen the hose things.
It's almost like watching
TV
sometimes.
Well, actually, the Mummenschanz hosted the Muppet Show once.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they were on Sesame Street.
First time I saw them. And then I saw them live at Zellerbach in Berkeley.
One of their most famous sketches, which they have been asked to repeat, I'm sure, a million times, is one in which the performers actually have clay on their faces.
Oh, yeah.
And they go up to each other and they make faces out of the clay on each other's faces. Or they make their own face.
And they react emotionally with the faces.
And they react emotionally with the faces on, the clay on their faces. It's really amazing stuff. I think it was just a couple of years ago that we went, as they were having a tour, an anniversary tour or something. And I came home going, wow, is there any way that I can capture some of the things that they were doing in fiction? It's really hard. When you have a live performance, and this is maybe something that's worth mentioning, live performance, I suppose a lot of what we understand of a performance comes from within us. And I felt when we were watching the Mummenschanz that a lot of what I was understanding was actually coming from me, because they would do these things with like strips of yellow that they would then bend into these shapes, but you would recognize kind of what was going on emotionally. I mean, what was being done was so simple, but what it was conveying was super complex. And I felt like it was really a performance where the audience was emotionally and intellectually on a certain level participating and adding meaning to what was going on.
Yeah, as far as a novel goes, I recently read the Never Let Me Go. And there are no facial expressions described, no emotions described. The reader has to figure out throughout constantly what they're feeling, what they're thinking. It's very much a reader participation book. And Cliff, you were involved in that discussion on Facebook
on
a few
Henry's
weeks ago.
page. Yeah.
Yes. It seemed as if people had to read the book several times to see all the layers of it.
Sure. And interestingly, just this week, John Kessel was posting about how much he hated it.
I saw that.
He forced himself to finish the darn thing, and he's like, "I'm done with this author," and
So,
yeah.
Cliff, do you see it as Cliff, do you see it as a book that's a framework that you hang your own ideas on as a reader?
I hadn't, but I can see that interpretation, and that's fascinating about the facial expressions. I mean, it's I just took it as kind of Hemingway-esque in that way, but I can see how that is used to both pull the reader in and distance the reader from these characters, right? The question of the character's humanity is paramount throughout the book. And I think obviously they're human, but you know, they're not treated as human. So, but then they are, right? I mean, once they create them, they want to give them a decent life and an education. It's very English, but so anyway, but performance-wise, there was this long-running thing in Chicago that only ended very recently called "Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind," which was 30 plays in 60 minutes, and it involved a lot of audience participation. They had the numbers 1 to 30 above the audience, and the audience shouts out numbers, and whatever number they shout, they pull it down, read the name of the play in the back, and then they go do it.
Oh, wow.
And they try and finish all 60 in 30 minutes. And it's very much audience participation. They also had a thing, if they sell out, they order out. They order pizza. And they call it pizza place. And I say, we'd like, you know, 2 extra large pizzas with, and then they hold up the phone and everyone shouts their toppings. Thank you, bye. And the pizza people would deliver it. Sometime during the show, they would stop the timer, they would pay for the pizza, and then they would start the timer again and continue on. So it seems to me like if you're world building, which we all are, the question of, you know, what level of fourth wall there is between the audience and the performance. Is there any, right? For example, if you are writing a medieval tavern scene, which, you know, for our sins we write, you know, the question is it going to be like the Prancing Pony, where the people in the tavern, as they would have in Europe, made their own music, right? There's no, if they didn't hire a band that night, there's no jukebox, there's no iPod, there's no piped in music. So if you want music, then the people in the bar create the music. So that is no difference between performance and audience, except maybe you take turns. And then that's, you know, today you can see that like in an Irish session. My wife used to play fiddle in the sessions around town, which is ironic because she doesn't drink. But anyway, there she was in the bar playing fiddle. And I would go and I would have a pint of Guinness and listen. But, you know, that was me. Sitar is not a session music instrument. And so, but on the other extreme, you have something like Western theater or No in Japan, where there is absolutely an impenetrable fourth wall. And oftentimes the characters don't break the fourth wall and they just interact with each other, and you are like, it's like you're watching it on TV. Or
yeah, sort of a voyeurish kind of.
Yeah. And then everything in between, right? Like Panto you mentioned. There certainly are, there's like some dinner theaters where like you choose the murderer and then they play out, you know, the audience votes on who the guilty party is and they play out that ending. You know, there's also haunted houses where there are performers and there are audience, but the performers are embedded in the space of the audience and interacting directly with the audience. Right? It's haunted house season, and so they're hiring actors to be in to jump out and go boo and scare the audience. There's also I read an article about like you can do an immersion zombie apocalypse thing where they've got a warehouse full of like done up to be like post-apocalyptic and a bunch of actors who are zombies, and the audience runs away from the zombies and gets picked off one by one, and whoever makes it wins, you know, whatever. You know, so I think that context matters, right? Like, so I'm going to give the example of India. In pre-1947 independence India, there was the concept of in the Raj, there were the Rajas, they were the kings, or there was various courts. And the job of a Hindustani or North Indian classical musician was to play for in a court. My teacher, Ali Akbar Khan, was trained to be a court musician. He was born in the early 20s, and he He came of age before independence, and his job was to learn how to play music in that setting where the person in charge, there was clearly someone in charge, and that person dictated what raga he wanted to hear. It was a he. And, or what, when he wanted to hear music, or if he brought guests around, your job was to entertain them on his schedule. And then, you composed and you would practice whatever when you weren't, but you were like a chauffeur or a cook. Your job was to, entertain.
Right.
But it was a job in a castle. Well, not a castle, but, a palace. And then all independence happened, and that social context for performance went away. And so all of a sudden, the musicians had to figure out how to navigate the Western model of performance hall performances with an audience who paid tickets, and it's a set time, from like 8 to 10. And so the morning ragas and the afternoon ragas and the late night ragas became less used because the ragas have time of day. So we've discussed this last week. Ragas have time of day association.
So when you're working full time for somebody in a palace, you can play any old time, which means you would be able to play any of the.
Whenever the boss wants you to play, you play.
Appropriate time of day.
This would be before stereos, right? I mean, there are record players coming into it. 78s were a new context for Indian music. Now, Indian music, you can take an hour for a rag, for just one rag. But with a 78, you had to record it in 3 minutes. So you had to figure out how to distill it in 3 minutes, which is its whole other discussion. So there is a concept in ethnomusicology. I'm trying to remember the name of the Charles Capo, I want to say. He coined the term schizophonia, which means a separation of the performance context of music and the listening of the music. In other words, you make a recording. And so the other thing that happened in the 20th century is first audio and then video. There became a separation of performance context and performance. And all of a sudden, you want to hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you don't have to wait till the local symphony plays it, or you don't have to wait, you don't have to travel. You can just put it on your record player or your, whatever later technology, CD, MP3s.
Right.
And the same with, like an opera. You want to see an opera, you want to see it live, you go to a movie theater and watch the Metropolitan Opera live at certain times, but you can also buy a DVD or Blu-ray or, back in the day, VHS, and watch it.
You can now see it in the theater too.
Yeah, right. Like I said, you can go to a movie theater and listen to the Met play or watch them. And so what it tells you a lot about, like if you're writing a book in which you don't have faster than light travel, but you are on a, say, generation ship. Maybe you want to have you have an archive of performances and you watch those. On Star Trek, they're always performing things.
Yeah, that is Star Trek.
In the original series, there's a whole episode based around Shakespearean troupe, right? The Conscience of the King. In the Next Generation, there's always classical music performances. And I've noticed it's always European classical music and European theater. And just once, I would like to see somebody play a sitar on the Enterprise or something like that.
Yeah, that would be
or
something.
Something. Do kabuki.
Shamisen.
Anything non-Western and anything non-classical, right? There's not even nobody plays jazz, right?
Well,
Jean-Luc plays the alien flute, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of thoughts. One was. One came from back when you were talking about 78 recordings being 3 minutes long. It's like the Twitter of recordings.
Yes.
And it puts pressure on the kinds of performances or utterances, right? So
it dictates them. You can't do the ring cycle on 78s.
No. That is true. There are a couple of thoughts that I had earlier, but you brought back No and Kabuki, which I think are interesting examples because they are actually Probably the most similar thing that we have in English is Shakespearean plays, because the Shakespearean plays are a fixed canon.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the kabuki and the no plays are a fixed canon of plays that are very, very old. Mm-hmm. In the case of the no, they were composed in the 13 and 1400s. And so, in fact, the Japanese in them is more different from modern Japanese than Shakespearean English is from our English.
That's it.
Yeah, it's actually, I took classes on no drama, and actually at one point I even studied how to play the taiko drum for no performances. It was pretty awesome.
I've seen the no perform. The Kita no came to the United States 30 years ago, and I've played gagaku. I studied taiko.
Oh, gagaku is also great.
Gagaku, which is another fixed canon.
Mm-hmm.
Done very no-like. They're very closely related, no and gagaku.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, and the characters in the no, at least the characters are standardized because you have these masks that can only be used for particular characters. Yeah.
You just need to put Mummenschott style clay masks on no players and see what happens.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I just thought that was interesting. So there are quite a number of world traditions that have fixed canon.
Yeah,
I that's pretty interesting.
And it always says something about the society, right? And who the audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, who the audience is for this and that. You know, and that changes. Again, like, you know, who the kabuki audience was in the Tokugawa shogunate is different from who they were after the Meiji Restoration, like who goes to see it, right?
The other thing is that no plays are typically like a couple hours long.
Yeah.
And kabuki plays last all day.
Oh my God, seriously?
And so that's another thing that we haven't mentioned yet. But if you're world building and you want to come up with a type of performance, how long does the performance last? Does it last 3 minutes on your recording? Does it last
all night? Indian concerts that used to run all night.
Is it all
people
night?
Coming in and out
all day? I mean, like in kabuki, you actually like have picnics in the audience, because you're there all day.
Oh my God, wow.
It was surprising to me, right? When I was first experiencing it, like I have never imagined that there could be a performance of a thing that would last all day.
Because like you'd think that like
days, so you know.
It's like a rock festival, really, you know. I mean,
yeah.
Well, it's considered
Western opera,
rude.
Without changing the operas, Western opera went from audience ignoring the just schmoozing and socializing and eating and drinking and talking during the whole performance, like it's a nightclub, to the silent audience, and the only interaction was applause and bravo, you know, from occasionally throwing flowers during the curtain call. And so that was partly by design. The composers, the role of a composer changed in Europe at the end of the classical period and the start of the Romantic period. And the composers gained more power. And so they demanded an audience that listened. But also, eventually, technology kicked in, and you dim the house lights because they were electric as opposed to a bunch of candles or whatever. If you can dim the house lights, you can start to control the audience because they can't do the thing that they were doing before. You know, and then you write a different kind of opera that actually requires the audience to pay attention to follow the plot, and you have more, you know, diva-like moments for arias and things, and then so that changes the canon. So there was a social change in the role of the composer. There was a technology change, and there was a musical change, and that changed the experience of the performance radically.
Yeah.
Over about 300 years. So, you know, and Wagner thought that opera was the ultimate art form because it combined ballet, which it does. They got incorporated ballet, singing, theater, you know, all of that. But he didn't anticipate movies, right? And so movies took over the ecological niche of the opera, but it democratized it. Whereas opera, like I remember somebody talking about, another musicologist talking about a cab ride, and they were in a European city, I forget which city. They passed the opera house, and the cab driver's like, "This is so great that, you know," we said, "How did they just restored the opera house with tax dollars? How do you feel about it?" And the cab driver's like, "I feel great. I think it's really important." He says, "Have you ever gone to the opera?" He said, "I would never go to the opera," right? Obviously, right? So, but the cab driver felt that it was very important that it be there and be, you know, nice.
So I actually, we're bumping up against the end of our hour, but I did want to mention one more thing.
Nice mime there.
there's a new type of performance that's very, very popular.
Totally raise my hand so I can talk.
And it's the YouTube video.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
like right now, like what we're doing?
No, not like what we're doing, but I'm talking about people like Markiplier and Jacksepticeye and the folks who play games, and you get to watch them play
like
games
Twitch
and make quips, and really it's a type of performance art. Right? And I think that a lot of people who are not used to this form of performance art think of it as a total waste of time, and what are the kids doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it art.
But
frankly.
when you watch these guys, they're performers. They're funny. They're comedian. You know, they have a comedic aspect to them. They're playing games, but you're not watching them for the games necessarily. I mean, they might be reviewing the games, but you're watching them to just see how funny they are and watch them just sort of create a spontaneous performance of this game and their emotional reaction to it that you might, as a player of that game, be able to relate to, right?
So it's kind of like MST3K for games.
Yeah, I just thought it would be worth, I think it's worth, you know, mentioning that kind of stuff, because in some of us are working in science fiction, and so we're like, well, you know, what is the future of performance? And yeah, there's probably like virtual reality and a bunch of stuff like that, and like, you know, like holograms and stuff, right? But we also see that there are these sort of unanticipated art forms that crop up because people like making art with whatever tools they have available, right? And so it's going to crop up with whatever new tools appear.
In Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, there's the fireman's wife has her living room set, where it's like 3 walls are characters in a giant soap opera, and she's given a script and she says her lines, and she's
right. Well, it's not like the holodeck, right?
Yeah. So you were gonna say something?
Jay, speak.
Well, I just wanted to do like the eating during performances, because there's some performances it's considered rude to eat during. Like you don't eat in the opera, you don't eat in the ballet. You go outside at intermission, grab a snack, shove it down, and go back in. Whereas things like movies and what you're talking about with like the kabuki, the day-long kabuki play where you picnic in the middle of it, versus, you know, all these other things where it's not rude to eat in the middle of it, I think is very interesting, because, you know, like dinner theater, you know, that's in the title. Right. But like you go to a Broadway play, and if you're sitting there eating popcorn or a sandwich in the middle of a Broadway play, you're going to get some dirty looks.
Yeah.
So I just thought that's very interesting, is like what is polite during the performance and what isn't. And for some, it's like there's such a variety, such a spectrum of, do you get to eat and drink during it or not? And like you may or may not know, you know, you may be the one who sneaks the candy bar into the ballet because, you know, screw it.
Hypoglycemia.
Right? Yeah. You know, like, you know, screw you. I'm bringing a snack in, but you know, so I just thought that was really interesting of.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing it up.
Is it okay? Like, what are the social requirements? Like, if you went to, like, if you had a day-long play and it was unacceptable to eat, and it was almost like this endurance test of like, or like, you know, I don't know, you know, some kind of penance or something where you have to sit through this thing and not eat or drink for like the entire day, and you just have to watch this thing.
Well, that would be another form of a, yeah.
that would.
Okay, you know, and there's also stuff like mass is a sort of a performance, right? And there are a lot of very strict rules about what to do when and how to participate. And I mean, that in and of itself is actually a really interesting left turn from what we've been talking about. Anyway.
There's I'm trying to find the title of the first story. There's an Adam Troy Castro series that started about his aliens, the marionettes, and they have this dance that they dance. Their marionettes are an alien species, and they're like kind of like spiders with more tentacle arms. And they have a annual performance where 100,000 of them go and they do a dance that continues year to year, and they all dance until they drop dead of exhaustion. This is an annual tradition.
But you can't participate unless you're planning to drop dead?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
It's considered an honor. It's an honorable way to die. And it happens every year, and it involves 100,000 of them, and it lasts until the last of them drops dead. And the first story is about a human and a reptilian species ambassador who are watching this. And the human spots in the middle of the dance this year, there's like a human dancer. Like, what's she doing in there? And that starts the whole story. So it's about a performance and about the society's reaction to performance and about the two ambassadors' failure to understand the performance because they are aliens. And I think it was like Funeral March of the Marionettes or something like that. He's had a whole series about the marionettes since then that have appeared in Analog and places like that. Cool. But the first one is, I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page, but it's Adam Troy Castro, and it's fabulous and it's really mind-blowing. The first one just blew me away when I read it because it was this whole new concept to me.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap up. We are the 24th today, so next week is Halloween. Are we all good to meet on Halloween at 10 in the morning?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think so. The week after that, we're going to have Spencer Ellsworth coming to talk with us. That'll be November 8th.
No, today's 25th.
Today's the 25th. Sorry, I'm just looking at my. Oh, you're right. So next week is not Halloween. So then it'll be the 1st.
Yeah.
All Saints Day.
Oh yeah, I guess Halloween's on Tuesday, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Is that right? Yeah, I gotta hand out candy.
My calendar at an angle is a very odd thing. And besides which, we actually have 2 calendars, and one of them has Sunday on the side, and the other one has Monday on the side. Oh, so I get a little confused at times. But okay, so it's going to be the 1st, and I believe that I will. I mean, I'll let you know if something changes, but we'll meet at 10 on the 1st. Why don't we talk about precociousness? That was a topic that was suggested a couple weeks ago, and what that means, because it's a complicated thing. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I will see you next week, and I'm going to stop the broadcast.
Bye-bye.